Hello and welcome to GastroLearning Live, wherever you are. Today we're talking about green endoscopy, a topic that maybe even 2 or 3 years ago, if you put that on a course, people wouldn't have the faintest idea what you were talking about. I think one of the reasons why we are talking about it now is because of champions in the field who are really focusing down and emphasizing how important this will be to the future of endoscopy and medicine and society. So I'm absolutely delighted today to welcome one of the real champions of this topic, Boo Hay from King's. Boo, fantastic to have you with us for this GastroLearning Live. I just wonder if you could start by setting the scene for us, not specifically with regards to endoscopy, but more broadly within our health services, what the issues are, and why attention on the environment and the way that we treat it from a medical perspective is now so important.
Yeah, thanks for the question, George. Great opening, and fantastic to be here, and really honoured for the invitation. All of this is occurring on the background of the NHS Net Zero initiative that started started in earnest just in October last year, with the publication of the Net Zero white paper documents that really set out the plan for how, as an organization, we should start to achieve a sort of zero carbon future for ourselves and for society, as you say. The target is that the NHS itself should be net zero as a whole by 2040. And we should be looking to achieve an 80% reduction by around 2035. And that then includes supply chain, as well as our own in-house, so to speak, day-to-day activities that occur in hospitals and GP surgeries. So I think these are ambitious but realistic and necessary targets to be setting. So that's kind of set the scene in which we're operating. And you mentioned that you mentioned about endoscopy, and the kind of surprising statistic is that endoscopy is the third highest generator of waste, the third highest sort of culprit, if you like, in terms of environmental impact in the hospital. We're second to anaesthetics and theatres in general, which may be actually not surprising when you think about it.
Yeah, where is that waste happening? Within within endoscopy, is it? I think that perhaps we feel, that the waste is what we simply, throw away at the end of the procedure. Maybe the PPE that we pull off at the end of every case. Is it? Is it more than that? Where are how would you divide up the areas in which we are wasting, and therefore that we need to address in policies to change?
Yeah, that's an absolutely central question. Thanks for bringing it up so early. I think what we need to make people aware of, and I think, to be honest, myself included in this, that we don't operate in a vacuum. The stuff that we use came from somewhere and is going somewhere when it leaves our endoscopy room. Either it's going in the bin to be incinerated, or it's going hopefully to be cleaned and reused in terms of our endoscopes. So endoscopy itself is a high throughput specialty. We do lots of procedures. There's a question as to whether all of them are appropriate. But we do use a lot of resource in cleaning those scopes. There are a lot of things that we can't reuse or recycle. We're kind of restricted a little bit by infection control policies, which, by the way, are changing. And we also ask our patients to travel backwards and forwards to the hospital on a number of occasions during the course of their pathway. So even by itself, endoscopy is a relatively high waste specialty. But then when you get down to the products that we use and the decontamination of the scopes that we're using, often maybe those are the sort of bits of the pathway that people don't think about, actually potentially have a greater impact on our carbon footprint or our environmental impact than the procedure itself.
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly say that one tends to be thinking about the in-room wastage and areas to address that. You will have a better handle on the potential environmental savings than I would. But to what extent do you think new ways of working in terms of non-endoscopic approaches to diagnosis do they have the potential to just changes in practice in that area? Do they have the potential to dwarf, from an environmental perspective, what we might do by recycling or using equipment in the room in a different way?
Yeah, that's an important philosophical question as well. I think I would, in short, yes, but it's much more nuanced than that. I think it shouldn't stop us looking to minimize the impact of the procedures that we absolutely have to do, and that's the key phrase. I think COVID did us a favor in some respects because it really laser focused our attention on appropriateness and triage, involving really senior decision makers in that triage process, which was very resource intensive, very, very heavy and very sort of strenuous, arduous sort of tasks to do that. But it's something that I think we'll need to learn from, apply in new ways using potentially AI or whatever. But triage and appropriateness of what we're doing has to be the first step. Some would say, listen, regardless of that, the demand for endoscopy is increasing year on year. There's nothing we can do about that. It's happening, and there are various ways in which that's being driven: population growth, population aging, changes in guidelines, all of those things that will mean that inevitably we have to do more. So we then at the same time need to look at ways in which we can make that part of the process more sustainable. But at the moment, the first step, as you say, I think you could probably achieve, a 25% reduction in your footprint by tight, robust triage and making sure that everything you're doing is appropriate.
Yeah. Okay. Again, an area that we don't see much of when we're in the endoscopy room is decontamination and water, and the water usage, both in terms of doing the endoscopies, but also what's going on in our decontamination units. Is there innovation coming in that area? Because presumably that is a source of considerable waste. Yeah.
The slide that's up at the moment just emphasizes just how much water, and I'm certain that this isn't widely known, that when you clean one endoscope, it uses up to 70 or even in some cases 100 liters of water per scope per cycle, which is an astonishing amount of water. And that's not just water; it's purified water. It's reverse osmosis is one of the most energy intensive ways of producing water that's purified to the point where it can be used to clean an endoscope. There are less energy intensive ways of creating pure water. That can be a start. And the more there are new AERs, new washers that use much less water per cycle, even up to, so that 50 or 70 liters can be halved or even more than halved by using a modern AER. So there are certainly ways in which we can make our existing processes better. And I think the other thing about you mentioned about PPE, I think possibly the use of PPE in decon has been overstated, because I think most of our staff generally use the same set through the course of the session. But that is an important thing, to make sure that we're making the most efficient use of the stuff that we can't recycle.
Yeah, and a couple of questions on water. I mean, you know, as you've got in your slide, we rarely reflect on the fact that we're often being given or using sterile bottles of water to flush down endoscopes. You know, more expensive, cleaner water than the patient is having in their gut, than if they went out to a posh restaurant and had a jug of water on the table. I mean, I think that, sure, you know, sometimes we need to step back and reflect on, you know, where we're doing our work. You know, we're doing our work in the gut lumen that day in, day out, is never sterile in any way at all.
Absolutely.
I
was going to say, not only is that water. I was going to say, not only is that water sterile, it's in a plastic bottle, and that plastic bottle has had to be shipped from mainland Europe or Ireland, where the manufacturing plants are, and then we chuck that plastic bottle in the bin and don't recycle it. So it's even worse.
I mean, you know, it is. I mean, just as an interesting, constructive thing for people to take away from today. What is the problem with flushing endoscopes with the same water as you would give the patient to drink after they've had their endoscopy? You know, you know, it's just worth people going away and having a think about the way that we do stuff, because there's an awful lot that we take as sort of it's a given that it's done in this way. And I suppose one of the aspects of how you're trying to get us to think about green endoscopy, and we'll discuss what we can all do within our own units at the end, but is to sort of start standing back and saying, okay, is there a reason for us doing this in this particular way?
Yeah, quite. And you're right, there's nothing stopping you doing that. And I'll give one of those examples that people often just cite, sort of shrug and go, well, it's infection control, isn't it? But you know, the sinks in our unit was built in 2013, so it's relatively modern, and they were all infrared sort of operated taps, so they turn on for a certain amount of time. And I sat there watching it, and one tap was running for 2.5 minutes, and I'd finished my hand washing in 20 or 30 seconds, and I said, why can't we time that down to 30 seconds, which is when we should be finishing? And I just got the shrug and went, well, it's infection control. I'm sure it's something to do with infection control. But then the sink in the other room went for 5 seconds, and the sink in the reception went for 30 seconds. So it's just about asking the questions, as you say, and just pushing back slightly against people's assumptions. But tap water is not. It's drinking. You hit the nail on the head. It's drinking water quality, not just tap water.
Yeah. Just a question just come through from Paul Harrow, one of my consultant colleagues at UCH, and I think it's a good opportunity to open the question about industry partners. I mean, the advances that we are now able to provide in terms of patient care are over the last 20 years, 30 years, are massively driven by innovation from industry partners. What are you seeing in terms of innovation, engagement from industry in trying to address these questions, which are, they're certainly not limited to the endoscopy room. They are going to be part of our lives and our children's lives. Are you seeing interesting, clever ideas coming through?
Yeah, I think. Let me preface that by saying, actually, so I forgot to say at the beginning that the NHS is responsible for 5% of the UK's carbon footprint as a country. So it's a huge chunk of what we do. And more than 60% of that is because of supply chain and manufacturing. It's got nothing to do with our day-to-day operations of hospitals. So a big chunk of our carbon footprint, we're reliant on industry to help us to shift, whether it be the way the products are delivered, the way they're manufactured, and also the products themselves. And I'm really pleased to see that a lot of companies have started taking note. The big companies that we do business with day in, day out as endoscopy, endoscopists are shifting. You can see sustainability statements on their websites, and some manufacturers have moved to 100% renewable energy in their factories. Things like that. But it's not just about manufacturing. It can be just in the way that products are shipped. So if you ship consignment of consumables, say in one go, and store them on site to be used rather than having weekly shipments, that can reduce your carbon footprint as well. And it's about thinking around the entire sort of pathway rather than just about a single product. In terms of innovating, we are seeing that's slower, and to be fair, it's coming more from smaller startups or sort of smaller companies, not the bigger ones themselves. But we are seeing products that are made from recycled materials, for instance, or products that can be more easily recycled. Those things are happening too.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It seems to me that there maybe is a tension that, well, runs through healthcare and maybe runs through industry and endoscope companies and accessory developments, which is that tension between individual patient safety, which nobody is going to deny is an absolutely fundamental factor, and societal and environmental risk. If one takes it to the absolute extreme, one might suggest that the only absolutely safe endoscopy would be in an operating theatre, fully sterile, with all aspects of the endoscopy being, single-use equipment. That is as close as you're going to get to absolute patient safety. But of course, that scenario is not possible from a service point of view and would probably carry a much increased environmental impact than the other extreme, which is you use an endoscope 1 million times, you don't clean it, therefore you're not using 100 litres of water every time. But of course, every patient or many patients would end up with an infection. So we somewhere in between, we need to find the right balance. And obviously that throws up the question of single-use endoscopes and where they sit. I mean, when I started, I'm a bit older than you, Boo, but when I started in endoscopy, all the biopsy forceps were multi-use. Yeah. We sent them off to be sterilized at the end. Nobody would dream about, certainly in the UK, nobody would dream about doing that now. And there's been some fantastic innovation in single-use endoscopes, cholangioscopes, spyglass, etc. Do you think there's a balance that we need to get? Where do you think that's heading, and perhaps where?
Yeah, I think
where are we going with that?
That's a really important question. If I might meander slightly. So actually, to preface it by saying that there is a movement away from single use already in terms of the consumables. So that ethic that we everything had to be single use and disposable is being challenged at the national level by the Greener NHS team. So those conversations are being had, and we'll expect that to permeate down, hopefully in the next couple of weeks and months. In terms of single-use equipment as a whole, I think my meander is to quote Niels Bohr, who was the father of quantum mechanics, and Niels Bohr said, if you try and explain quantum mechanics to a man on the street, if he's not immediately horrified, then he really hasn't grasped the problem. And I think the same is true of single-use endoscopes. If you try and explain it to the average man on the street, if they're not immediately horrified, then they haven't really understood. So my approach to single-use endoscopes is one of guarded horror from an environmental perspective, but you can understand that there are nuances and arguments to say that actually, when you analyze the entire pathway of what we do in endoscopy, there may be some arguments in favor of single use in specific situations. But we really need to understand what those use cases are. And I would also say that as endoscopists, we manage risk. It's everything we do is about managing risk. And I think understanding what the relative risks are and putting those risks in balance, I think, will lead us to the right answer. At the moment, guarded horror.
Yeah, and I think that we, as you say, the understanding of risk and what the absolute risk for an individual patient is of particular scenarios. The risk of an untoward outcome related to almost any type of endoscopy, certainly ERCP, massively dwarfs by hundreds of folds the risk of problems related directly to the endoscope and endoscope cleanliness. That does not mean that the risk is zero in any way, but it's I think the overall question of risk is a really important one. So can I just press you a little bit on on the question of rowing back the issue about single use? Are you suggesting that biopsy forceps? I'm again, it's something we do every day, but this is a beautifully engineered metal instrument that we take 2 biopsies, and then that biopsy is dropped in the bin. And goes to, well, actually, without digressing too much, where does it go to?
Yes.
Where does the bin go to that is full of biopsy forceps and this and that? Landfill? It certainly doesn't go to any form of recycling at the moment, or does it?
No, absolutely not. And it either goes to landfill or it's incinerated at high temperatures. And incinerating a ton of that waste at a high temperature generates a ton of carbon dioxide. That's the rule of thumb. Wow. If you were to separate out the constituents and you're able to recycle even 50% of that biopsy forcep, you would knock out more than 80% of the carbon footprint of disposal. So it's worth pursuing. It's something that we could really work on as a specialty and say, look, what can we do about this? We are using a lot of stuff for one endoscopy, and sometimes we open equipment that we never use, and that equipment then goes in the bin. Biopsies themselves are impactful, and there's no economies of scale. The more biopsy you take, the more carbon is expended, or the more pots that you send, the more carbon is expended. So three biopsy pots is equivalent to 2 miles in a car. And we certainly wouldn't drive 2 miles. Well, some of us might, but we certainly wouldn't drive a mile in a car. I'd walk down to the shops. I wouldn't get in my car now, understanding what the impact on the environment is. So we really. Do
you have a feel for what percentage of endoscopies, and therefore, for example, how many biopsy forceps would be used at King's over a year? I mean, do 70% of endoscopies result in a biopsy? It's probably no less than that, I would have thought.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting question, because it's not something that we necessarily have analysed, because it's not something that we've thought about in the course of our day-to-day practice. I know Mark McCallendon had published something on whether or not biopsies taken at upper GI endoscopy, for instance, actually made a difference to the outcome of the patient's management. and that was in around 15 or 16% of cases.
Yeah.
But biopsies 100% of the time. So 16% of the biopsies that were taken made a difference. So there's not. I think we do take a lot of unnecessary biopsies, and we could be replacing those with another means of assessing the patient for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, doing a bog standard ERCP, you know, I would probably use at least 4 or 5 single-use accessories. You know, the sphincterotope, the wire, the balloon, you know, biopsies, brush cytology. You know, it's you know, sometimes you only need to turn around at the end of a difficult procedure and look at look past the sweating nurses at their trolley, which is, you know, piled high with a lot of stuff, all of which at the end is going straight into the it's going straight into the bin. Fantastic discussion, Boo. Just before we move on to what we as individuals can do, and not just chat about it, you and others are involved in some interesting position statements and guidelines. Just tell us when we can expect to see them, and I think BSG, ESGE. What's in the offing?
Yeah, thanks for that. So both the BSG have really come good, and to their credit, I think we're already thinking about sustainability before we sort of came on the scene as Green Endoscopy. So there will be a position statement coming out very shortly. There'll be a sustainability survey being sent to all members to get sort of a feel of the lie of the land. The ESGE are developing their guidelines, so they've just started collecting the group for that. So it may take a couple of months to come out. JAG have already put sustainability into the new update of the GRS for April of this year. So section 1.9 already states that departments must have a sustainability group, a green endoscopy group, and have at least undertaken one project to reduce the carbon footprint of their unit. Fair enough, that's not a make or break criterion, obviously, but it's in there, which is a fantastic first step, and we can look to build on that. So, and there are lots of grassroots stuff happening, and it's really encouraging to see people sort of coming up with ideas, championing sustainability in their own units across the country and across the world.
So, I mean, you know, the whole nature of climate change, environmental impact is, as individuals, we look at the news and you can end up feeling, oh God, you know, I might be sorting out my recycling in the bin, but you know, there's nothing else that I personally can do to impact this. Is the sort of slightly nihilistic view that, you know, is completely understandable in a way. But as we finish, would there be any specific bullet points or specific tips or things that we as individuals in our endoscopy unit should go away and think about or do?
Yeah, that would be great. I think I always say, and I think there was a slide about looking on the bright side. There we go. There it is. And it's a question that we've come across and we've thought about right at the start of this. I think it's really important to keep an attitude around sustainability and around climate change that keeps us moving forward. It isn't somebody else's problem to sort out. This is the world is literally on fire, and we've seen that climate change doesn't affect just people in Papua New Guinea or wherever. We've seen the floods in London, in Wrexham, in Cambridge, in close to home. We've seen the effects now, and we just need to start moving quickly. And as I say, just so in terms of practical things that we can do, I think the first step, I think, is to identify just one thing, just one change, and the one change that is probably the simplest thing that people can do is to get recycling bins into their endoscopy unit. because your trust, your hospital, will already have the infrastructure to do that. They will already be funding. There'll already be a pathway. You don't have to do any of the legwork for that. Just ask your waste management team for recycling bins and start it. And then that gets people interested. It gets started. It starts a conversation. It goes, oh, I've never seen a recycling bin before. What do I put in the recycling bin? And then that conversation then starts, and people become more aware of what they can do as individuals. And the last thing I'll say about that is that actually it's important to understand that I'm not going to stop anyone buying an electric car or recycling at home, but the impact of what we do in healthcare at work is considerably greater than what we do as individuals at home. So if we can make changes at work, that will probably have a greater impact. And so this is where I'd really encourage people to get involved and get started and keep going.
Brilliant. Oh, fantastic. Absolutely inspiring and encouraging advice, Boo. Are there resources? We had a few questions coming through saying, are there resources to help? And certainly we, will put any resources onto the GastroLearning site. It sounds as if the resources are to an extent being built as we speak, but yes. Are there other sources to go to at the moment?
Yeah, so the Centre for Sustainable Healthcare has been one of our main champions. So they've got a really good website and a forum at which discussions happen. You can learn a bit more about carbon footprinting. E-Learning for Health now has a module. It's not mandatory, but you can go and learn about that alongside your fire and safety. Greener NHS, which used to be the SDU, the Sustainable Development Unit on the NHS, has their own web pages within the NHS website, and there's some really useful stuff there. We, as Green Endoscopy on Twitter, will continually post stuff, but also come to us and DM the Twitter handle, and we'll if that's what you do, and we'll respond. And it's more about learning from each other. The BSG will host some stuff on their web pages as well. So it's very much about learning from each other and moving forward as a specialty.
Fantastic. Yeah, well, great summing up. Really inspiring session. Lots of chatter on the questions and elsewhere. So Boo, thanks, collectively thanks, actually, not just for joining me for this GastroLearning Live, but the work that you and colleagues are doing. I think it's really going to bring about important change. So thanks ever so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
All the best.
Cheers.